The Steam Deck has gotten numerous amounts of updates, and it's a very different system than it was even just a few months ago. Does the Steam Deck live up to expectations? Does it live up to the hype? What does it accomplish? Is it truly a game changer? Why get this over a gaming laptop? And consoles, PCs, does it even matter anymore when you have the Steam Deck in your hands? I've spoken at length about the ergonomics in a separate video, so if you want to check out my opinions on the ergonomics, click on that video and check it out. Basically, I like the ergonomics a lot. It feels very comfortable in the hands, and I can play on this thing for literally hours. Not like the Nintendo Switch, where I can play on it for a few hours, but my hands start to cramp up because the controls are uncomfortable. I do quite like all the buttons, though I wish the triggers had more range, and I do wish the Steam and quick access menu buttons didn't suck so badly. The controls are quite responsive too. I've had little issue with playing games that many consider to be difficult, such as fighting games. And the D-pad? The D-pad's like a solid 8 out of 10 in my opinion. It could be a little clickier, but honestly, there isn't a whole lot to dislike here. The thumbstick touch sensors, the gyro, the trackpads, the back buttons, and the touchscreen all add a new dimension to gaming, though we'll talk about that in a bit. I need to split up the review into 2 different segments. This video here will be about the Steam experience, as well as like physical stuff like controls and whatnot. The next video will be about emulation as well as other storefronts, and of course the Linux desktop experience. So if you want a review on that portion of the video, then you'll have to watch the other video as well, because this video is all about Steam and Steam games. And it's pretty obvious Valve wants you to buy those. And luckily, most PC gamers have a ton of Steam games in their library, many of which they'd probably never touch otherwise. I have spoken at length about the Steam interface in prior videos, but I'll give you the rundown. Basically, it's good. Valve was going for a consoleized approach, and it seems to work. Most things are self-explanatory, and for every new page you go to, Valve explains what each page does. All of which are pretty self-defined, and you should be able to figure out what you're doing if you've ever played on a console before. You're more or less given the whole Steam platform, which includes features that aren't on any other platforms. Most of the Steam interface isn't that different from regular old Steam. Of course, the biggest redesigns can be found in both the Steam library as well as the Steam store. The store looks drastically different from your regular old desktop store. There's a new section in the Steam store called Great on Deck, which plays into Valve's verification system. All games featured in this section are verified titles, meaning they should work out of the box without any sort of jankiness. On the topic of verification and Great on Deck, I think it's time we talk about the verification system. The PC ecosystem is a wild, wild west. You never know how some games will turn out on different PCs. Thankfully, the Steam Deck is one PC, and so Valve took up the task of having to test each individual Steam game manually to see if they run well on Steam Deck, or if there's some sort of weird issues going on. In theory, this is a great system. It lets consumers know which games work the best on Steam Deck. It also lets players know which games can be played on the Steam Deck, but with some manual adjustments, and what games just straight up do not work on Steam Deck. In theory, it's a perfect system. In practice though, it's still mostly perfect, but there should be some adjustments made. For starters, not all unsupported games are actually broken on the Steam Deck. Quite a few of them work just fine, and you could probably play through the entire game without any issues. And of course, some games rightfully deserve the unsupported rank. That's not too bad, right? What about the playable and verified ranks? How do they fare? I want to talk about a game that doesn't work perfectly, even when marked as playable. Azure Striker Gunvolt 2. You want to know what the main issue is though? The main issue is you can't get the true ending on the Steam Deck. What do I mean by this? Well, a spoiler alert is in effect. If you don't want to get spoiled, be sure to skip to this timestamp. So when you're playing the final stage as Gunvolt, when the final boss does her ultimate attack, the game crashes. But why though? There's a lot of speculation, but a lot of Linux wizards seem to believe that it has to do with audio drivers. That's right friends, this is one part where you have to use your microphone to sing some J-pop in the mic, or like you could just blow into your microphone like a cheap bastard. And to get the true ending, you have to beat the game as both characters, and if you can't beat the game as one of the characters, then you can't access the true ending, and the true final boss. What's interesting though is that on Windows, if Windows doesn't detect a microphone input, you don't have to do that, and instead the boss uses her other skill, which is a normal attack that you have to avoid. I think it's pretty obvious that Valve tested this but only played as Copen, because this attack doesn't happen if you're playing as Copen. Alright, spoiler time is over. Basically, the game crashes on the final boss for one character. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't call that playable. I'm not really sure who should fix this, Inti Creates or Valve. In the case of Proton though, I do think the ball is in Valve's court, so maybe they'll fix this. Aside from the one weird issue that I found in one single game, every other playable and verified game I feel deserves their rating. Okay, I think it's about time we talk about the experience of playing some of these games. A vast majority of PC games nowadays support controller, so it should just be really easy to hop into a game for the most part. As much as I'd like to sit here and just show a bunch of graphs telling you frame rates and whatnot, I don't believe that accurately describes the experience of playing games on the Steam Deck. As you might have anticipated, the Steam Deck is a perfect indie machine. I own a ton of indies on Steam, and so basically most of them just work. And unlike most portable consoles that most consider to be indie machines, you know, like the Nintendo Switch or the PS Vita, you don't have to do port begging because most of them come to PC first. So we all knew indie games were going to run well. But what about AAA titles? Well, I can safely tell you that AAA titles for the most part just run really well on the Steam Deck. Look no further than Cyberpunk 2077 running on the Steam Deck. I don't own the game, but there's a ton of videos of people playing that on their Steam Deck, and it runs great. Great for a portable system, that is. Now, one game that I have been playing is God of War on my Steam Deck. The PS4 God of War, I mean. It runs so buttery smooth you would not believe it. It runs better than on PS4, which is saying a lot. With the right settings, it can stick to 60 FPS, no problem. Gonna be real with you, of all the games I've tried out, I haven't found a single game that runs like crap on the Steam Deck. And because this is a full-on PC, even if it does run like crap, you can always just go into the settings and change graphical details and whatnot. Now, how is battery life? Well, battery life greatly depends on the sort of games you're playing. It's fairly obvious that AAA titles will drain more battery than indie titles. Though I would say while playing AAA titles, the Steam Deck is on par with the original launch Nintendo Switch, which is the only Nintendo Switch I own. Yes, I'm aware that newer revisions have better battery life, but I'm not going out there to buy another Nintendo Switch. Playing indie titles allows this to exceed the 5-hour mark, and with proper tweaking, you could even make it to the mythical 8-hour mark that Valve claims is possible. The Fox managed to do it, but that's a lot of work in the quick access menu, which we'll be talking a little bit later in this video. As for the screen itself, it's a touchscreen. It's kind of okay, I guess. The colors, they're not the most accurate, but they're serviceable. My hope is that in the future, someone can create an aftermarket screen that has better color accuracy. It doesn't even have to be OLED, it just has to be a better IPS panel. And the speakers, wow, the speakers are great. Like, I'm used to having phones that have downward firing speakers, and like, that's kind of okay. But these just blow those out of the water. It's pretty loud too at its highest volume, and at the highest volume there isn't too much distortion that I can hear. On the topic of audio, there is one issue that really annoys me. Occasionally, very rarely, sometimes when I unplug my capture card from my Steam Deck, the audio doesn't kick in, and so I hope that Valve sorts out plugging things in and out of, well, external displays, because this is going to be really, really annoying, especially when the dock comes out. Let's talk about thermals and the fan. So the thermals can get up there in the 80s, though the 80s is still technically safe. It's not a very comfortable place to be. Unfortunately, I'm not a big YouTuber, so I don't have a lot of thermal testing apparatuses available, nor do I have decibel testing systems, so I'll just have to use my words to explain things. Though the CPU and GPU may hang around the 70s and 80s, the sides never got hot. I assume this is partially due to its size and the fact that all of the hot components are in the center of the device. As for the fan, there are some reports that suggest that there are actually 2 fan types that are in Steam Decks currently, and one of them has a lot of coil whine. However, Valve has been pushing out quite a few updates, especially targeting the fans. We'll talk more about updates in a bit, but essentially it's remedied the situation quite a bit, though at the cost of thermals, which is why the Steam Deck currently runs at around 80 on AAA titles. There are DIY remedies, but that goes outside of the scope of this video. So playing the game is great, but you know what's even better? Being able to save battery, or customizing your own controls. So let's start with the quick access menu first. The quick access menu gives you access to notifications and a bunch of performance tweaking settings, allowing you to change your device's TDP as well as the GPU clock speeds. Now mind you, this does not let you overclock your Steam Deck. What this does let you do is crank down the performance for games that don't really need it. older PC titles as well as indie titles. They don't need all of that power, so you can reduce some of it to save some battery and maintain playable frame rates as well. There's also two unique options that you can watch out for. The first of which is a frame rate limiter, which obviously limits your frame rate on your Steam Deck. Given that you only have a 60Hz panel on your Steam Deck, it doesn't really make that much sense to uncap your frame rate unless you want better inputs. The next unique setting is the ability to change your screen's refresh rate, which is different from frame rate, by the way. Remember how I said the Steam Deck had a 60Hz panel? Well, you can actually downclock that to below 60, all the way down to 40Hz. This sounds like a terrible idea, I understand. But believe me when I say it's a lot smoother than 30 FPS. It's no 60 FPS, but for games that can't hit 60 FPS, this is a nice compromise. It looks a lot smoother and it's more responsive than 30 FPS. Do note that this option doesn't really play nicely with capture cards. I would know, I've tried it. Also, each game can have its own performance settings, so you're not stuck using the same performance settings between indie games and AAA titles. Like Starbound here doesn't really use a lot of GPU, so I can afford to reduce the GPU clock frequency, and as such allocate more power to my CPU. Now we get to talk about Steam inputs. For my Steam controller faithfuls, I'll have you know that all of your controls will just transfer over. If you've already got an established control scheme for your game on Steam input, then it'll just transfer over almost seamlessly, depending on what controller you used prior. You'll want to test your controls and then modify them as needed. But for the inexperienced, what the heck is Steam Input? Well, Steam Input is a supremely powerful remapping engine. Initially designed for Steam controllers, now it can be used for all manner of controllers that Valve supports, including, of course, the Steam Deck. In its base form, Steam Input allows you to map controls to different controls. And heck, you could map keyboard and mouse controls to, say, your Steam Deck. Meaning games that were previously mouse and keyboard exclusive can now be played on controllers, albeit slightly janky depending on what game you're playing. The Steam Deck also includes a gyro. As we all know, if you want to be an FPS god on consoles, you'll want to make use of gyro. There are also additional features that go beyond the scope of just remapping buttons. For example, this radial menu here, you can use it to swap items instantly or swap loadouts instantly, like in the case of Starbound. Now, there are some features that are available on desktop Steam Input that aren't available on Steam Deck Steam Input. But I'm hoping Valve will bring these forward, and I'm hoping more players make use of Steam Input so that Valve can improve Steam Input even further. Of course, not everything is hunky-dory in the land of the Steam Deck. We have to address the major elephant in the room: games that don't work on Steam Deck. Not all games will work on Steam Deck. A decent portion of it has to do with games running anti-cheat. So yes, a ton of developers brought their games with anti-cheat onto Linux. Like, even just last year, you would have never expected a game like Apex Legends to come to Linux, and yet here we are. And even Japanese titles are getting in on this Linux action, like Phantasy Star Online 2, New Genesis. You would have never expected to see PSO2 work on Linux, but even so, there are still major games that don't work on Steam Deck, like Destiny 2. And judging from Bungie's official stance on the Steam Deck and Linux as a whole, it doesn't seem like it's going to be a thing unless you install Windows on your Steam Deck. There's also specific oddities in the UI especially, and just general issues that Valve could fix up, such as the keyboard obscuring half of the key when you're trying to type something in. There's also the fact that the left and right arrow keys on the keyboard do not move anything. It's never worked for me ever. There's also the fact that shader caches take up so much of your space. You might have bought a 1TB SD card, but your internal storage is still going to be filled up with a bunch of shader caches and prefixes and re-encoded videos and all of that stuff. Hopefully you didn't reserve the 64GB model, otherwise you're screwed. Or you could just buy an SSD and swap it yourself, if you're technically inclined, that is. Another thing to mention is updates for the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck is a very different product than it was when it first came out. Most of that is due to updates that Valve has issued out. Basically, this video is going to be outdated in like a solid couple of months. That is, if Valve keeps up the update schedule. Valve has added many killer features, like the ability to change your refresh rate on your Steam Deck, among other things including bug fixes. Basically, the Steam Deck's going to get a ton of updates in its first year. As for its second year, well, it's hard to say. So what do I think about the Steam Deck from a regular customer's perspective? I think they'll be pleasantly surprised how easy it is to get into PC gaming with the Steam Deck. And yes, the Steam Deck is very capable of going outside of the Steam ecosystem. If you want to stay in the Steam ecosystem, that's a perfectly valid option. Steam more or less is a fully featured platform, and for the purposes of just playing Steam games, it's a very solid product. The Steam Deck itself is deceptively light. thanks to its ergonomics, and it's quite portable. Most of your PC games can go anywhere so long as they don't require online DRM, and even if there was online DRM, there's remedies for that. However, if there was one major con that might turn away some consumers, it's that not all games work. The only real way to get those developers to support the Steam Deck is to make a lot of noise in their official communications channels. You know, a peaceful protest. This is definitely my favorite way of playing video games now. I've almost stopped playing games on my PC entirely, except for like the couple of games that don't work on the Steam Deck. And even so, I can still use my PC to stream to it. We'll talk more about that in a future video. So if you like my content, please like, subscribe, share with your friends, join my Discord server, and also enable notifications.